Thanks for being here at the end of the day with me, guys. We're going to get you to the bar just as soon as we can. So, hello, my name is Richard. I work at Betable, which is an online gambling operator. We make it available as an API, so two guys in a garage with an iPhone can build legal, regulated gambling games. We do the math and the money. They do the game part. It is awesome. So, over the years, I've worked in a bunch of places and experienced a bunch of different development environments. A lot of peculiar and historically informed systems, a lot of things that make you turn your head, and a lot of things that have worked really, really well. So I started working at Flickr when I got out of school, and at Flickr there was, for a dozen or so engineers, one development environment. One. dev.flickr.com. You would go to it, you would run code there, everyone shared it. It was the continuousest of continuous integration that is possible in the world. And it worked because people were conscious of this and were working in a way that kept everyone tightly coordinated, kept people from stepping on their toes. And yet it still felt a little odd that we had such a large amount of tooling about everything else, but we couldn't bother to have more than one development environment. So when I left there, I worked at OpenDNS, and we had sort of exactly the same thing. It was Linux remote development environments, but this time there was one per engineer. And that meant we actually had the problem of integrating with the mainline before we did releases, but no one was stepping on each other's toes. You could really go wild and tear things apart and put it back together later. The problem there was not in the flexibility, it was in the tooling and the management. When you started at OpenDNS, your first day, or more likely your first week, was spent sitting next to the last guy that started and figuring out how to get a development environment working. And there was a lot of updating the wiki page because it has fallen out of date in between the last guy starting and you starting. Certainly not a high-quality development environment, but we limped along with it. So I after that, started a company called DevStructure, and we were trying to tackle this development workflow configuration management problem with a tool called Blueprint that was figuring out what you did and helping you iterate and share that with each other and with production, and that was an option as well. Square had a Mac-based development environment, so everybody had a Mac. You're actually not allowed to have Windows at Square. That is a rule. And they had a big shell script, a big fragile shell script with all the good and the bad that comes with that configured a plain old Mac to do Square Rails development. And that served the purpose. But it was totally different than production. And the degree to which that it was similar was because someone took the effort to run the same version of MySQL or the same version of Nginx. But if one environment, if production upgraded, like when there was an Nginx 0-day, likely, and in fact didn't, the development environment didn't come along with it. So there's divergence there. And when I started working at Betable, I was determined to do it better. We had an opportunity to build this green field that really encapsulated everything that we wanted the engineering infrastructure, the processes to be like. And so looking back at all the tools that I had used over the years to manage development environments, to build out the process around making changes, developing software, shipping features, all of them have some holes in them. All of them have something that we're going to need to shore up. And since, as an engineer, I've always had sort of an operational fascination, though only recently really been called an operator. The focus for me has always been on how things work in production, in visibility into the system as it's behaving for real users, and I haven't cared as much about what's going on in the dev environments. And so that led me to the biggest mistake that I made at Betable, and I made it immediately. On day one, and keep in mind this was, I said, a green field, this product did not exist. the first thing I did was start building the staging and production environment. So I got my Puppet out, and I puppeted really hard, and I built a lot of automated tooling, and in fact, I'm really proud that as a company, we have a business requirement to be able to provision the whole stack, one command, because we do it all the time for audits and tests and external whatever. And so it is good, but it's only for staging and production. And the problem there is that there weren't any customers that was helping at the time. The only people that I could have actively made their lives better were my coworkers, and I was totally ignoring them. And while I was ignoring them, what was happening was the Cowboy Wild West on the laptops. It got bad. So the advice that I repeat, that I've codified, I formalized with trying to tell people how cool DevStructure was as developers, as engineers that are shipping real services that real people use, we need to reduce the distance between dev and production in order to be able to confidently ship at the rate that we want to for serving customers. You want to get it live, obviously, because that's how they get value out of it. But if you can't model effectively what's going on in development, in production, in development, you have a tougher time being confident that it works. So we have a couple of options here. We could say, back up your mail, your laptop's going into production, but the real way to earn this confidence in development is to work in a very production-like development environment. So the rest of this talk, I hope that that's a motivation to care about this in general, and now we're going to make a little more of the what I learned and why we made the decisions that we made, and then I'll finally eventually get to actual code on slides that you can visit later and start to use it if it's useful to you. So let's start with our most basic goal. We're trying to reduce the distance between development and production. And that means, at its most basic, some sort of automation. But let's set some more specific goals to this. So our actionable goals are homogeneity, that we want every engineer's laptop for some value of the same to be the same. We're going to restrict that to a manageable subset of things, and we'll see that, well, I'll get to that in a moment. We also want automatic provisioning. The new guy on his first day shouldn't have to go sit next to someone and figure out how it works. We need automatic maintenance because our reality is changing very rapidly, and if everyone's not progressing, then we're going to have that situation where Nick's development laptop has diverged from the mainline, from the standard that everyone else is using, and that's going to reduce his confidence in his ability to write code that ships and works well. And then last, we want to avoid a big, heavy IT process. We're 13 engineers, and don't have the resources or the time to manage locking down laptops so that people can't set their screensavers and things like that. That is well outside the scope of what we're dealing with. I don't care what editors people use, on and on. We care about that core of the development environment that we want to keep in a very same and simple and automated way. So we've got a number of options, and this is, it's sitting down on day one thinking about how we're going to tackle this problem when I, a year later, realized, actually, I made this mistake, that we should have been automating our development environments from square one. So we can talk about building shell script automation, much like Square did. We can talk about using Vagrant or VirtualBox or some other VM provider directly. We can do Boxen. I don't know if any of you guys were in Will's talk earlier, but Boxen is certainly an option, and having an open source community and GitHub behind it is certainly compelling. We could also not use Boxen, but just use Puppet on our laptops, thanks to Nigel and all of those guys that made Puppet on a Mac really work well. We could also use cloud servers, maybe in our cloud, maybe in their cloud, that people log in remotely and do their work. All options all have pros and cons, and this is how we whittled it down. So shell scripts. I talked crap about it just a minute ago and want to emphasize that we've figured out that it's not a sustainable thing to do in production, right? Everyone pretty much agrees, and I'm going to assume that that's so because you're all at PuppetConf. So if we're trying to reduce the distance between development and production, and the first thing that we do is something we would never do in production, we've already lost. So shell scripts are out. So we're left with our good options, no shell scripts. And now I want to talk a little bit about the hard lesson we learned with DevStructure, which is simply that a remote development environment is a very hard sell for most engineers, be it because of offline access, because they fly and hack on the plane, be it because of latency concerns. Most often, though, it's editors and just sort of user interface stuff, that the remote environment was not going to happen. We couldn't sell that as a product, and being my attitude towards operations, especially as it relates to the rest of these engineers, is that I'm serving them, and so the development environment has to serve them as best as it possibly can, and one that right away is tough for them to work in is a non-starter. So remote options are out. So we have our local options here. We're getting somewhere. We're getting closer to a real solution. So now let's talk about VirtualBox. There have been, 12 talks about Vagrant here this week, so I'm sure that people are familiar with using VMs, are aware that you can go lower level than Vagrant. And we built out at Square some lower level VirtualBox stuff so that we could test our pre-Puppet, our pre-config management workflows. So you can actually PXE boot VirtualBox. It's nearly undocumented, but I went back and clean roomed what I did at Square, and so now you don't have to. So if you use this Puppet VirtualBox module on your Mac, it'll get VirtualBox set up, and it'll build a few command line tools out. So you can do vbox up name, and you'll get a PXE booted, totally vanilla Ubuntu that you can go do with what you please, like perhaps run your production Puppet code. So that's a thing as well. Now there's Vagrant, since we're not PXE booting real servers, and I think at this point, many people aren't PXE booting real servers anymore. You can use Vagrant, and that gives you sort of next level up in terms of automation and helps get over the hump with editor access and file system access, and there's a lot of nice stuff there. I'm not the one that needs to tell you, though. Those other 12 talks, or however many, will do that. But then this happened, and I think the GitHub people have had a similar experience. I'm sure this discussion comes up every time someone says the word Vagrant. And this guy, Nick, who's a brilliant engineer and one that I don't want to make unhappy because he might leave, is that given a VM, what he would end up doing is just installing all this stuff on his laptop by hand, doing all of his coding there, and then using his VM as sort of his private integration staging environment. And probably shortly after that, just skip it entirely and push directly from his laptop. So in other words, him and a larger number of people than expected weren't on board with that. And that was going to create this sort of divide where there's the people that are disgruntled about having to use VM, and there's me, basically. And I don't want to be the bastard operator from hell. This is DevOps, so we're all working together. So we're not doing VMs, simple as that. Because when you're setting out to build an automated system, there's, I think, two important properties in very broad terms to think about. Something has to get better, and identifying what that is that you're making better through automation is important. And the other is that nothing can get worse. And this is stated in different ways every once in a while as making the easiest thing also the right thing to do. And here's a list of stuff, non-exhaustive, I'm sure, that not using VMs that using a Mac gets you. So you have full first-class citizens for editors and GUIs. You don't have to do goofy port forwarding stuff. You don't have to deal with NFS like Vagrant does. And you get a Unix-like environment, at least on a Mac. And if there are Windows people here, I apologize that this isn't going to be as actionable as it would be on a Mac. And there's a little bit of a rub to this nothing can get worse thing, because you have to think about that in context of who things get worse for. So there's really only one thing and for one person that gets worse by building Mac automation for development environments, and that's mine. And since my job is to serve the developers, to make the rest of our company, to make our product teams more effective, a little bit of headache for me that gets us happier and more productive dozen other engineers is a win. Because from their perspective, nothing's getting worse. Whereas a VM is obviously, that's the big worse thing for them. So now we're down to things on the Mac. And we're down to Boxen and not Boxen. He gave a talk about Boxen. The motivation for why they're doing things the way that they're doing things is totally sound and totally awesome. And the closer they get to actually using the Boxen modules in their production code base, the less of an issue that I have with it, really. Because the goal for me, when I started to formalize this, is to use our production Puppet code base. And for better or worse, that's not compatible with Boxen. They have a lot of stuff that isn't ours, essentially. So their Node.js module, which does work cross-platform and so on, isn't ours and doesn't use the same package repositories and on and on. So the goal for us was to use our production Puppet code base, because that is going to pull this development laptop that much closer to production. It's going to be the same thing as best as we can make it. And then in an effort to save time and not get distracted and to keep the core of this as small as possible, we don't need to worry about managing Evernotes and Fitbits and Spotifys and all that stuff. I trust engineers to set their own screensaver. They can do whatever they want. So now we're to the point where I should talk a little bit about how we use Puppet at Betable, and it's going to be very brief because it's not interesting, frankly. We do it masterless. We deploy via Git over SSH. We use this thing called related nodes as a different thing instead of exported resources, because the API that I really wanted was a function that I could give it a resource, package nginx, and get back all the IP addresses that have that for populating Cassandra seeds or load balancer, upstream lists, that sort of thing. It's totally Ubuntu. It's like not even making any attempt at the beginning of this to be cross-platform in any way. And then the development process for this was based on VMs, is based on that Puppet VirtualBox stuff. So we have the ability to spin up total copies of Betable in any old VM, Rackspace, or whatever. And that's the development process for Puppet, and then it goes through the same sort of promotion from staging to production as anyone else. There's a few things that we needed to add to make this a compelling thing for running on a Mac. Most notably, we need a package manager. There are a bunch of providers in Puppet for sort of package-like things for Mac, but they're all pretty useless. So we use Homebrew. We need the Xcode command line tools because we need compilers, not least because Homebrew's trying to build everything from source, because why not? And then, as a little bonus, we need the Cassandra schema and some data fixtures that allow us to run integration tests. And we actually, because of the way that Cassandra works, schema is not the same as it would be in MySQL. An alter is always instantaneous because it's not actually affecting any of the stored data. So we just grab it from staging and run it on the Mac, and it's fine. We have all those key spaces and all the column families defined. They're the same everywhere, and then we can manage the schema more like data than like configuration. There's also a few things that needed to change on the Mac, things that we were already doing, and just running through. We'll talk in more detail about Java and Git. We'll talk about how the typical production mentality of the fat jar style of deployment, where you package all your dependencies together, you sort of vendor stuff, and we actually vendor things at the last possible minute. Whatever passes tests, all the dependencies get bundled up together with it right then. But in development, you don't want that. You don't want 10 copies of your shared framework library. You want one so that you can actually do meaningful development on that library. Obviously, service supervision is going to have to change on a Mac, and of course, there's going to be a lot of if Darwin sort of conditionals to get around little differences in file locations and things like that. But then there's this fundamental chicken and egg problem. I mentioned before that we deploy Puppet with Git, so it's stored in a Git repository, so we need Git. And this is our way of solving the chicken and egg problem. It's an eye chart here. The code is there so that you can copy paste it later if you feel compelled to. Here's what it does. It downloads the official Git disk image. It unpacks it. It installs the package that's in it. And then it sets up the Puppet package DMG installed file in VARDB so that it appears as if Puppet installed this package. And we'll circle back to that later when the Git module in the Puppet code tries to install Git. It's going to observe this directory and see, oh, we've already got Git. The version's good. Let's move along. So now we've gotten around the chicken and egg, and we're able to clone our production Puppet code onto the Mac and run it. So that gets us back to the next level up thing we need. We need Homebrew. And this actually, I'll admit, you can shame me. This was my first experience using the Puppet Forge. On the upside, it went very well. The module does a lot of great stuff, and because Homebrew, I think it was written by a Debian user, so a lot of our production stuff just works because the package names are the same. And then there's Xcode, because the downside of Homebrew, not the Puppet part, just Homebrew itself, is that it builds everything from source. So we grabbed the Xcode command line tool DMGs from Apple's paywalled site, host them on our package repository, and let the Homebrew module do what it does best. So those two together, it's not a one-liner, which is a little bit dissatisfying, but you grab the right DMG and you give it to the Homebrew class, and you're almost home. The only other thing we had to do is this dubious Xcode select program, which, to cut a frustrating story short, it has to exit 0, but it doesn't have to do anything, as best I can tell, and at least in our environment. So that's an empty shell script that solves the problem. That's why that's there. And I don't care to research it further, truthfully. So next thing. Yeah. Yeah, probably could have just linked to true. Yeah. That would be shorter. I'm going to go change that. So the next thing we had to fix up was installing Java. So we build our own JDK packages from Oracle for Linux. We don't on a Mac. We use Macs. This is a boring slide. I'm pointing this out because it's really hard to tell if that file is the right file. Again, your mileage may vary. I think that's the right file. It works on brand new laptops. It works on mine. It seems to upgrade if something's already there. So I think it does the right thing. The bummer is, of course, that there's no way to ensure latest. And so there's a good chance that 004 is not actually the right number anymore. So pay attention to your updates, especially with how many Java security updates there are. So the next thing on our punch list of things that we need to do differently on the Mac are not Git itself, but the Git repositories. Since we deploy a lot of stuff with Git, we have this Git repo type that we defined in Puppet. It's not a Ruby type, it's a defined type, a Puppet language defined type. And we kept the same interface in place, and we can argue whether this is a good idea or not, but it does two totally different things depending on what environment you're in. In staging and production, it makes a bare repository that we can push to, and it makes a working copy that the post-receive will update and restart services and all that. In development, that gets if statemented out, and we just have a local working copy in your home directory in the source tree that's ready for development. And coupled with that, so we've got source code checked out now, but we need to get all of the paths wired up properly to be able to actually run the code. So we use a lot of Node.js. We can argue about that as well if you so choose. And so we have npm link resources and npm install resources that get all of the machinery hooked up. And remember I mentioned that we vendor a lot of stuff as we build it for staging and production. These are how we do the opposite in development, where so our Betable Games service depends on a library called Node Betable Framework. It's the everything bucket repository that I'm sure we all have. That becomes a symlink in development so that there's one development copy of that library, and these resources are how that's managed. It's not a surprising implementation, and it could be a little bit more elegant and read the package.json file. Go is a lot easier, though, and that's my favorite thing right now. I know I'm in good company there. You just set Go path, and so we have Puppet set up a profile with a line in it that says export Go path home, and now all of the Go stuff can be spread out horizontally rather than sort of layered and vendored within itself. And now we're done. So service supervision comes in two flavors. And I think in production, it probably shouldn't, at least. In development, in reality, there are two types of things. There are those that we develop and those that we don't. And for the ones that we don't, we use LaunchD because Puppet supports it, which is excellent, almost. And it's how you supervise a service on a Mac. We don't want people to have a terminal window open to keep Cassandra running. That's a poor interface. Looks junky. So we wrapped the service type that manages service Cassandra and have this same thing with its parameters manage the plist file, and it's dumb. It plugs in the args and the label and puts it in the right directory, and it's done. And then we have a running Cassandra service that we don't have to worry about. Now for other sorts of services, things that we're developing, things that are changing all the time, putting them in LaunchD would be a huge pain, and everybody would be mad and ask for a Linux VM probably. This one, I haven't quite settled yet. We have people that like using Screen. We have people that like using tmux. We have people that use Foreman, which is not the Puppet Foreman thing. It's I think it came out of Heroku and their proc file design, which it'll just run a whole bunch of processes in one terminal with crazy color-coded labeled standard out, standard error. Because these are such a personal, high-touch thing, it's how you interface with your running developed code. It's unspecified, and I think what we might have to actually do is just support all three of them. So there's a set of services that's known to Puppet, and Puppet is going to be able to set up a tmux configuration, a screen configuration, and this proc file thing, so that whatever flavor you choose, you're going to be able to supervise all this stuff easily. And the greatest thing is that I actually didn't have to do any of this work. All I'm going to have to do is put it into Puppet, if that. So back to this notion of reducing the distance between development or production and development. The process of deploying into development is not one that gets talked about very often because it's kind of weird. But the reality, and I'm sure that this is shared because it's been the reality at every company I've ever worked for, you have a lot of services, a lot of bits of code And nobody can be bothered to pull. Nobody is so on top of things that they're always running the latest stuff because you forget, because you're doing something else, because you didn't even know that that library existed. And so we have to have a good way to automate the maintenance of this environment when in reality, most of the repositories that people have checked out are not being worked on by that particular engineer. So we want to keep up to date, but we can't keep too up to date. And so at a high level, what we chose to do is make this a pull, not a push. In production, it's push it out, get it out there as soon as you can. You know when it's being updated. For development, they can run PuppetMe anytime, and it'll pull the latest Puppet code and run it on their laptop, such that they're going to get as up to date as they can. And this the Git part of this, that development side of the Git repo, does the clone and remote update, and then it does a fetch and a merge --ff only, so as to not clobber something that's actively being worked on. That's, I think, obviously going to be a frustrating experience if you're kind of constantly having to course correct because other stuff's changing underneath your working copy. So we're making efforts to not mess with people's flow. And then, given that we have this nice automated development environment that is kept up to date, that is able to run the full integration test suite, when you're ready to deploy to production, you just push to master and the CI pipeline takes off. And that would be a whole separate talk, so I'm not going to do that. The important thing, though, is that because this development environment was set up in such a realistic production-like way with everything in its right place, all those deploys to production are more confident, and everybody's able to move faster. So to complete the analogy, we turn the Cowboys into ranchers. There's homogeneity now between both the various production staging development environments. Everything looks the same. There's also homogeneity amongst all the development laptops. We have not, since we put this in place, had a single works on my laptop, not on his issue come up. I think that's a winner. We've got automatic provisioning for new hires down to the point that it takes longer to do their tax paperwork than it does to provision their laptop. And because we're running PuppetMe all the time, we've got this nice automatic maintenance that's keeping people as up to date as they can comfortably be with the rest of the system. And because this is why I'm here, really, if you are interested in the gambling software space and taking it to an industry that hasn't been innovated in 100 years, I'd love to talk to you, and we're especially interested in people that want to operate big, important web services. So, thank you very much. And our friendly AV staff reminded me that there's a microphone for questions so that the people on the video can hear it. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Nothing? Everybody wants to go to the bar?
Hi, good talk, by the way.
Thank you.
So have you had any instance of, works on my Mac laptop, but then doesn't work when it gets to presumably the first step in CI, which I guess is, there's still like a testing Debian environment it's going to hit, I assume, after that push?
So yes and no. So the CI environment is Linux. It's as exactly like production as we can make it. We have encountered a couple of things where and it's actually been the other way around, where there are bugs in Go code that totally break horribly on a Mac and are totally fine on Linux. And for better or worse, I just close won't fix any Go bugs that have a panic that says like mock semaphore, some Mac kernel thing. Don't want to do it. Haven't seen it the other way around where we unexpectedly break in production when it worked fine on the laptops.
I guess you haven't hit one yet, but I'd be concerned that at some point you might, I don't know, be stuck with a bug where you're stuck on one way or the other, and I don't know, maybe it's not even fixable. I don't know.
It's a risk, and I guess balancing it with the happiness and sanity of engineers. It's a risk that we're willing to take. I don't know. I don't know what it's going to look like when it happens, but it's incomplete test coverage, you could argue, if it does happen.
Cool.
Anyone else?
Howdy.
Hello.
So it seems one of the differences there between like the Boxen stuff is Boxen's really interested in kind of the high-touch stuff, as well as, okay, we have some stuff for dev. You guys are more, this is the dev stuff for your high-touch, do your own type of thing. Do you still expose the ability for, because ultimately it's Puppet underneath the hood, somebody says, hey, I want to put my DAP files or everything else in. Do you allow those people to do that?
Actually, not through Puppet, but for all of our production and staging and everything systems, your user account, as it's configured, there's an option for a Git remote in that class or defined type that's wrapping user, such that your whole home directory would be a Git repository. So your dot files follow you that way.
Sure. Well, I mean, that would be for the simple stuff. For anything else anybody else wants to do, I guess you're leaving it largely here. You're on your own. Like, you've got Puppet. You've got that instance of it, like, take it away type thing. Rather than, oh, we'll provide you, like, a managed service type deal.
It's, we're only doing it for engineers right now. I could certainly see future work moving in that direction. I bet it would come not for individual customization, but for other software that the whole company needs. Same as we might get into making sure editors are available, that sort of thing.
Sure. Cool. How big is the development staff that you guys have right
We have
now?
13 engineers, 29 employees.
Awesome. Thanks.
So I know you said that the VMs were out of question at Betable, but I was setting up a dev environment over at my place. And my scheme was thinking about going with Vagrant and then having the project live in /Vagrant so that they could use the choice of editors, edit the code, but still use the same Puppet code and run it on the Vagrant VM. What do you think about that?
So I'm sure that's gotten better. I know historically there have been performance issues, and what always breaks that sort of thing is the full text search in editors. Personally, I would love to use VMs for everything because I think that's even closer to production for obvious reasons. But first priority for me was to make the engineers that are actually building the product happier. We do, I think I mentioned, we have the VirtualBox stuff, so VM options are available for any that want it, and anybody that's working on serious operations stuff has a VM as well. I think that's it then. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for staying all the way to the end.